It was the early morning of the March 24, 2005. A day that began like any other. The residents of central Myanmar slowly woke up to what seemed like another typical day, complete with the same rhythms of life. The sun started rising majestically over the city of Mandalay, shining its warm rays on the streets below, and life went on as it always did, entirely unaware of the mayhem that was to unfold. Unknown to them, far below their feet, the earth was getting ready to unleash a destructive force, ready to rip itself apart in ways they never could have imagined. Precisely at 9:26 a.m. local time, the ground beneath us began shaking violently. A very powerful and intense earthquake, measuring 6.9 on the Richter scale, struck deep within the interior of Myanmar, just north of the legendary Irrawaddy River. What had started as a minor tremor soon developed into a ferocious and devastating force of nature, bringing with it complete chaos, a total sense of bewilderment, and an absolute sense of fear amongst the residents. The horrific tragedy would ultimately claim the lives of hundreds of individuals, hurting thousands more, and ultimately leave an entire nation reeling from its impact in shock and disarray. Yet, it was not just the damage to buildings and roadways that made this tragedy so terrible. The profound psychological trauma inflicted by the earthquake would be felt and recalled by the victims for decades to come. The earthquake strikes. The initial shockwave, it began with a rumble almost imperceptible at first, having the sound of thunder in the distance. But it was not a storm that was coming, it was the earth itself, unleashing its fury. In the city of Mandalay and in the surrounding villages, a disturbing and alarming phenomenon occurred as buildings began to sway precariously and then eventually crumbled to the ground. The streets, which once served as pathways for daily life, cracked open dramatically, and the ground itself split apart in an unsettling manner. Individuals found themselves thrown violently to the earth, as the very ground beneath their feet buckled and twisted in a chaotic dance. This catastrophic event arrived without any prior warning or indication. The level of destruction was immediate and overwhelming, as if the forces of nature had suddenly decided to turn against the innocent people of Myanmar in a tragic display of power. In those initial and panicked moments, the city was a nightmare come to life. The sounds and roar of falling buildings resounded throughout the landscape, mixing with the horrified screams of those who were still inside them. People frantically ran for their lives in a desperate attempt to escape the devastation, but the constant quakes continued to rock the ground beneath their feet, each one poised to bring additional destruction and chaos to the already ravaged cityscape. For those unfortunate individuals who found themselves trapped beneath the heavy and unstable rubble, there was simply no time left to entertain any thoughts of hope or possibility. Amidst the chaos that surrounded them, an overwhelming sense of panic began to spread rapidly. The relentless shaking of their environment felt as though it would never cease, and for many of those individuals, this cacophony of destruction would ultimately be the very last sound they would ever hear in their lives. The aftermath, a period of extreme devastation and relentless desperation. When the shaking stopped, the damage was clear. The city was unrecognizable. Buildings that once stood tall were in ruins. Streets were cracked, and emergency responders were not able to reach the most affected areas. Power lines were severed, and entire communities were left in the dark. The immediate human toll of the disaster was simply staggering and unimaginable. Over 1,000 were killed, tens of thousands of others were injured, and a vast number of those injuries were life-threatening and dangerous. Hospitals nearby were overwhelmed and had an influx of patients, and doctors, along with volunteers, worked tirelessly and around the clock to provide aid to the injured individuals, but there was little that they could do to ease the suffering. The extent of the physical destruction was horrifying to witness, but it must be stated that the psychological impact on the survivors and the people was equally horrific and far-reaching. The survivors, some of whom had witnessed in horror the devastating destruction of their homes and the agonizing loss of their loved ones, all within seconds, were left in deep shock, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The streets were lined with the lifeless bodies of the dead and the agonies of the dying, an overbearing environment where there was no place to escape from under the asphyxiating cloud of dust and debris that surrounded them. People frantically looked for their loved ones among the wild wreckage, holding on to hope and praying desperately that they would be rescued alive against all odds. In many tragic instances, though, it was already too late for those who were lost. The real horror of the earthquake did not come from the initial shock that made the ground under us shake. It was more the suffocating sense of helplessness that came after. Every second, help was agonizingly late to reach those who were hurt, leaving the survivors to do nothing but sift through the wreckage and devastation around them in hopes of finding some sort of hope amidst the ruins. While the earthquake which struck Myanmar was undoubtedly disastrous and caused tremendous damage and suffering, it struck at a time when other, much larger disasters were competing for attention and dominating the global news agenda. The earthquake which had just struck Indonesia, a mere few months prior to the Myanmar crisis, and other prominent and disastrous events such as the South Asian tsunami, cast long and dark shadows on the global response to the Myanmar crisis. In spite of the gruesome and enormous loss of life that occurred, along with the tremendous suffering of the victims, the global response to the disaster was slower than it ought to have been. The country's far-off geographical position, combined with its political isolation from the rest of the world, along with an extreme lack of decent communication infrastructure, meant that many individuals and groups in Myanmar were in a position where they were left on their own to fend off the catastrophic effects of the disaster without due assistance or aid from outside agencies. Myanmar, albeit in ruins, was unfortunately all but forgotten by the global community. While some aid did eventually begin to trickle in, it was less than what was truly needed. The Myanmar populace, already struggling under the yoke of poverty and hardship of political instability, was left to endure not just the disastrous consequences of the earthquake, but also the profound international apathy that came in its aftermath. The world community failed to act quickly in response to the disaster, and the people of Myanmar were left to suffer their pain and grief alone, their vast misery largely unnoticed and generally unheeded by the rest of the world. The lengthy journey towards healing, reconstructing life while navigating through the darkness of grief despite being confronted with the monumental and daunting destruction that surrounded them, the resilient people of Myanmar found the strength to embark on the lengthy process of rebuilding their lives and their communities. Families opted to return to their homes, if they were fortunate enough to still have homes that had not been utterly annihilated. Those individuals who had managed to survive the harrowing experience of the initial earthquake were pushed to their limits as they fought to rebuild their lives, painstakingly reconstructing everything, brick by brick, and nurturing hope with each small step forward that they took. Yet recovery was not only concerning the efforts of rebuilding the destroyed physical structures and buildings, it was also equally about healing the profound emotional wounds and repairing the broken hearts and minds of a nation that had been severely traumatized and polarized. Complete recovery for Myanmar from the nightmare earthquake of 2005 would require many long years of struggle and effort, and even now, the scars of the disaster are still there, visibly on the ground, and deeply etched in the hearts and minds of those who survived the experience. The earthquake in 2005 resulted not merely in physical damage to buildings and infrastructure, but also in a profound emotional effect characterized by a pervading sense of loss and an overwhelming sense of fear, a grim reminder of the intrinsic vulnerability of life itself, and how easily everything we are apt to take for granted can become permanently shattered and destroyed. However, despite all the suffering and tragedy that occurred during these years, the people of Myanmar exhibited an amazing degree of resilience and strength. They began to rebuild their lives and communities, they mourned their losses, and in time, they managed to move ahead in hope and resolve. Although the terrible earthquake in 2005 has perhaps faded from immediate public recollection and is no longer a dominant subject of discussion, memories of that horrific day, along with the lives lost and the tremendous struggles faced by so many, must always remain in our hearts and minds because they can never be forgotten.